welcome to Minor Compositions. And for this week, we are joined by Kike España, who is someone that I met, let's say, was it 4 or 5 years ago, Kike?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
um, Through some mutual friends in Malaga, who were involved in a number of sort of closely related projects around publishing and in the local neighborhood they live in, and also through Casa Invisible, a sort of social center in Malaga, which is quite interesting. And since then, I've been reading some of Kike's work about sort of architecture in the city and space, which is quite interesting. So I thought it'd be a good excuse to invite you along to have a chat about the work you're doing, um, because the commons always exist in a space, oftentimes in a city or in a town, and thus our relationship to the space and the spaces we occupy and are occupied by is super important. So with that relatively informal intro, I'm going to hand it over to you to Kike to talk about what you're working on, and then we'll have a chat about it.
Yeah, great. First, thank you very much, Stephen. Um, yeah, I'm very happy to be here with you. Also because I mean, before we met, of course, I knew about autonomedia and minor composition projects that were yeah, many of them, and especially the undercommons, very also influential for us. So yeah, it is great to also be here and to share more and more things. Also because what we started as also a publishing project was also in the midst of these forms of understanding publishing, which we think it's quite important, and it was very yeah, a very nice example to try to copy and to be influenced by. So okay, so I will try to explain a bit what I will put also a timer. What I develop at something called Communize the City, and with the subtitle of Towards an Insurgent Vicinity. Afterwards, we will talk more about this concept of vicinity, because in Spanish is the same word for vicinity and neighborhood, which is vecindad. Yeah, but which in Spanish it has also more sense because it's a very popular term, but at the same time quite uh, deep theoretically, which I think is also quite interesting to try to yeah, develop some thoughts on contemporary thinking in the city and in the space, which I think is quite important. So this is basically the idea. Is basically that I will develop a bit the main understanding of what I called, based on Achille Mbembe uh, term concept of brutalism as financial brutalism, how we think cities in this in this kind of planetary ethos or condition of the world. Uh, and then I will develop basically first three problems that I think it has the city form, so the city as a concept and as a development. Then try to pair these problems with three kind of potentialities of what I think is the commune, or the informality of the commune, not as a form, but as something that is beyond the form, or from the informality of it. Yeah, and then it's basically more into kind of into action in a way, like uh, components or developments of things that I feel that are now on the ground on different urban struggles that are like the possibilities of try to build things like that. That it will end also with this concept of intercommunalism, but also yeah, with different things that we can sum up in something like wholes in the city. That is the main idea around it. Okay, so I will more or less between reading and improvising, but a structure with a kind of a text. So yeah, I mean, first is this idea that is something deep that is happening in the cities today. I think it's not just a crisis of housing or rent that we all feel and we all have around, but it's a profound fracture that cuts across the whole social ecology in which live in. So we can't live in cities, and yet there is no escape from it. In a way, there is no kind of reserve that we can apart from. So, and the problems of that are it has its basis on what I would say that the lively and unruly neighborhoods, that classically the working class neighborhoods that once sustain other ways of living, have been disarticulated by decades of speculation. In the UK, you have a lot of experience with that, but in something that we could call now financial brutalism. Brutalism, the concept developed by Achille Mbembe, is a kind of a planetary logic of extraction of everything that is alive, in a way. As he put it, a geomorphic power that fractures bodies, territories, and subjectivities at the same time. So, to sum up this situation, cities has become logistical infrastructures of extraction, designed to eliminate mediation, erase friction, and to make capital flow without resistance. So if we put it in a kind of historical context, if industrial capitalism was dependent on the exploitation of physical labor, and cognitive capitalism has depended on the exploitation of knowledge and social cooperation, logistical capitalism now seeks to eliminate the dependence on subjects. And that means to make bodies work without friction, without resistance, without error, and without delay. It dreams, logistical capitalism dreams of a world that runs automatically, with a kind of algorithmic management where the exploitation of everything that is alive is brutally optimized for the flows of financial logistics. But, and here comes like a turn of we are in this situation, of course, but in the ruins of that brutalism, which we live in the exhaustion of the subject that some authors call radical alienation, like Stefano, for example, Stefano Haney and Fred Moten, there is a kind of unexpected gift that they also hinted. The radical alienation of logistical capitalism has undone the subject and erased the bonds of belonging and recognition to a system, to a society, to an identity. And this is not all necessarily bad news. First, because it opens up the possibility of understanding insurgency beyond subjects and their fixations, in forms of resistance that do not seek recognition within the system, society, and identity, but operate in its margins, in its ruins, and by the emergence of their own potentialities. Second, because insurgency does not occur only through subjects, nor only in tension with labor, but occurs through bodies, the living and the matter, in friction with that brutalism. And third, because it is especially in the ruins of this brutalism that pretends to logisticize the world completely, where holes, failures, sabotages, leaks, ungovernable margins, unforeseen behaviors, inexplicable events, and unthinkable imaginations appear and emerge. Okay, so in this context, I will try to just develop very kind of quickly, first, three forms in which the city the city form is problematic, or three aspects of it. And why, basically. I mean, first, urbanism and also the story or the way in which cities are told is always a beautiful story, in a way, in which the city was born in the Greek agora, grew with democracy and reason, and became the great open project of modern civilization. But this is not true. I mean, the city form as a device, as an infrastructure, has always been an infrastructure of enclosing what is common, and commons also. And I will highlight three components of this city form that sounds progressive, but hide a deep violence in different forms of exclusion. First is citizenship, and the exclusion is in the legal order. Then is civility or civism. I don't know how it's better called in English, but in Spanish is civismo. I think it's civility, but I don't know. In the level of the social order, and renewal in the level of the economic order. So first, citizenship was born tied to property. Whoever owns belongs. And the rest, the dispossessed, the migrant, the care workers, the workers in general, or any subject that is not male, heterosexual, native, and owner, it's rendered invisible or disposable. So citizenship has always been kind of the polite face of exploitation by exclusion. I will not get deep on this, so I will go a bit quicker, and then we can chat on every one of these things. So the second is, as you mentioned now, something like civic spirit or something like that. That sounds in a way harmless, sounds like being polite, don't shout, keep everything clean, like behave. But it's one of the most powerful technologies of control in the development of the city and the experimental forms of governmentality, because it constructs the social inertia with obedience in the everyday behavior. There is no better police than one that is self-assumed, internalized. And this civic spirit makes domination feel natural and neutral, because it's like the way in which things should work. The city form has always been the scenario for experimenting with different forms of domination and government, and the tide, the connection between civilization, civility, and the kind of the civic spirit is very clear, also in its colonial past. Also, the third component is renewal. Urban renewal, in a way, is the aesthetics of the violence of exclusion, is the beautification that hides the evictions that are contained in the process of renovation and renewal. Renewal is accumulation by re-extraction. So I mean the process of extracting new things. A financial reactivation that is ready to search for the next opportunities or financial opportunities. Gentrification, touristification, musification, and other multiple forms of speculation are nothing more than the effects of the same basic problem, the financial renovation of the city, where every beautification, reform or urban development, or whatever term you invent for it, has segregation and brutalism at its core to make, again, accumulation possible. Renewal is always exclusion. but it does not always make use of the borders understood as lines of demarcation that separate distinct sovereign entities. But as also Achille Mbembe developed in his book, it uses the process of borderization as, and now quoting, the process by which the powers of this world permanently transform certain spaces into impassable places for certain classes of population. So together, these three components or these three problems, citizenship, civic spirit, and renewal, compose a kind of a moral architecture of financial brutalism by exclusion, discipline, and extraction. And yeah, so this is a bit the kind of the situation of these three problems. And now I will develop as the next part this idea of informality commune as form of repair or reparation in this kind of damaged situation of brutalism of the world. If the city has become the logistical matrix of capital and its infrastructure, then transformation, emancipation, forms of resistance must begin by repairing the fractures from within. And this means not by seeking an outside that is outside of this, but recomposing what survives inside the ruins of this situation. And this is what I call here in the text informal commune, that in a way relate to the developments in the Grundrisse by Marx in this differentiation that in English is very clear between the city and the commune as two different forms of different formalizations in which what Marx wrote is commune only exists in its real assembly, in the coming together, not as a unification, but as a gathering, as a real assembly. It's something that also Fred Moten developed in the book of I think it's Black and Blue in one of the chapters, also in relation to this chapter of Marx, to these quotes. So from that idea, I want to develop or to share with you three components that I think this informality of the commune has in its core, and it's not a formalization, not a form of uniting, but as a components. One is vicinity, that in Spanish is related to neighborhood also, but not only. Vicinity as mutual interdependence between bodies, matter, and the living. So this will be the idea behind it. Then subsistence as sustaining the living in environments of disturbance, of this situation of brutalism, ruins, and so on. And the third component of insurgency as the tension of everyday ungovernability, unruliness, or indiscipline, as you want to call it. In a way, these three components are connected with classical forms of the subject, organization, and revolution. It relates to these kind of things. What is the subject? In this case, it's not the subject, it's the proximity or the mutual interdependency, subsisting as not exactly organizing through a party or a form, but as sustaining the living conditions in environments of disturbance. And revolution as not as an epic event, but as this tension in the everyday with the ungovernable or unruliness. So again, vicinity or neighborhoodness, or I don't know how to call it, vicinity, is not only a proximity in space or a shared space that we are close to, but as I mentioned, mutual interdependency. So it means that it's not about identity, but about this relation or interconnectedness. Is the friction of everyday life between bodies and matter. I would just hint here to the developments of Abu Malik Simon that are quite interesting in that matters. He's basically sawing or seen in the suburbs of Africa and Asia people or these forms of in a way the way in which people improvise networks or constellations of care and subsistence in different forms, like cooperating in precariousness, which is quite interesting and a very important thing to learn from, I think. The second is subsistence. That, of course, it has a more philosophical component that is different to existence, but more the way in which things insist as livings. And it's also, as I see it, a form of keeping sociality going without permission in different situations of violence, exclusion, and is the thing that keep sociality going. And this connects with different authors and traditions. Like one could be the feminist thinkers like Maria Mies, for example, that of course reminds us the way, and they develop also a form of subsistence economy and so on, which is quite interesting. I think it's not only the way in which not only the way of surviving, but the way of also informal forms of economy in exploited situations like the Global South or in also other situations. So subsistence is not poverty, is the basis of all social life and all sociality in a way. So it's in a way, an ecology of mutual care and collective repair, the form of collective in the sense of constellations of interdependency. And the third component as insurgency, not only as revolt or uprising, but friction itself, frictions with domination, with subordination, with discipline. So it's the refusal to be smooth, to be governable, to be predictable. So if financial capitalism dreams of a world without friction, insurgency is the way of multiplying friction in this sense. And sometimes insurgency doesn't mean that is the great shout in a situation, but also forms of evasion, of minor inventions, and forms of insistence in not complying with certain governmentality, discipline, and so on. Okay, so to finish with this part, with this also three components, then we will come up to, in a way, the more come to earth, or what in classical terms would be what to do, a strategy, and how all these terms can come to concretizations also. And I will not develop any example, just how these things relate to forms of communizing the city. That is, in a way, the idea behind it. So, and to put like an image for this is, if we imagine the city as this kind of plane of immanence in which the financial brutalism has kind of almost collapsed all its situations and all the territory almost completely, the idea of communizing the city will start with holing, so making holes on this plane of immanence that we call city, in this financial brutalism. So the idea of holding would be how the idea of the informality of the commune in a way breaks into the existing city. And it doesn't mean necessarily that it's new breaks, but also understanding things that we haven't seen before as also breaks. So this means also making breaks in the walls of logistics and control. So all forms of sabotage and changing the way in which the normal logistics of the city works that happen, but also forms of sociality that are normally captured and but that like historically were out of this condition of control of the logisticality of the city. So holes are not metaphors, are concrete practices that we should develop in the cities to create other forms of developing things. I mean, as you mentioned, social centers are, for me, one example of making holes in a city, but there are many others, of course. So in this sense, I will just tell the little story of how in Malaga in the last year, and I will go directly to the end, how the 29th of June of last year, 2024, in Malaga, there was a big demonstration called, the slogan of the banner was Málaga para vivir, Malaga to live or for living, and not for surviving. And that brought more than 25,000 people into the streets, and there was a turning point in the whole history of the recent history of the city, in which the kind of touristic city model was never questioned in a big scale, and this was the first time that this was increasingly questioned as a new form of understanding that the city has to go in another direction. So what I wanted to develop here is what happened after the demonstration, not in the event itself, but after that, kind of informal movement started with the same name, Málaga para vivir, Málaga for living or to live, where different things appear. One was neighborhood committees in 3 different neighborhoods of the city, in which were only run by monthly assemblies and then working groups working in this level, which we think it's quite interesting, and also trying to develop something that now it's not very far, but that in the first moment was also interesting, connected with different ecological catastrophes that happen in Spain. One is the floods in Valencia, but also the electricity shutdown in different moments. That is called something like subsistence programs. That it means that there is forms of maintaining kind of different forms of living in the city, even in moments in which catastrophes and these forms of exception, in a way, will multiply in the future. So there are also possibilities for making these holes bigger and also to sustain it without the need of the infrastructures of the existing city, of the kind of the financial capitalism and its brutalities. In this situation, there were like 4 kind of verbs that we're working on: occupy, eat, heal, and care. And these were like different forms in which these things intertwine. There are now very little attempts in this way, but I think it's interesting to mention. This is what was one thing. And the other one developed not only with this movement, but also with the tenant union of Malaga. It was called Bloques en Lucha, or Blocks in Struggle. That means how people that are going to be evicted because they are putting the rent higher and so on, they stay in their own buildings and fight together for the building. And this is something that is now going on, and that we are organized with them, and it's quite interesting to see. Now it's only like one kind of working, but there were many attempts, and this is also one example of how to try to extend these forms of resistance and forms of understanding the city in other forms, and also facing the problems that we are living in without the mediation of the traditional forms of politics so in the left and so on, which I think is also interesting. I will not go deep on that because I'm already close to half an hour, but there will be like two other concepts. One is the duality of powers. That is also a classical concept that goes from Lenin to people like also Toni Negri and others has relate to, which I think it's also interesting because if we think as I was mentioning, the city as this plane in which we make wholes, these forms of wholes are also forms of counter powers in some ways that has to deal also with the existing powers. So, but this is kind of other chapter of the thing that I think it's also quite interesting to go deep on it, because at the end, communizing the city will be having another infrastructure of revolution in a way, or of resistance, that at some point has the praise or the call or the idea to sustain life without being kind of erased. And this is connected with the last concept of intercommunalism, that is a try to connect with other genealogies of international solidarity, that I think it's much more focused on these bonds between communal lives that has to develop. And I think it's quite interesting how to think intercommunalism as a learning to live as neighbors of this damaged planet in without the limitations of border states, cities, and so on, but a form of reparation that requires, in a way, renouncing to, as also Mbembe put it, the exclusion, the exclusive appropriation of the earth that at the end belongs to only to itself. So this is to end up here. The main idea of the whole thing in relation to these aspects of first problems, some ideas how things are happening more or less in some places, and then also the connection to how to scale the conflict and these things in a kind of also the planetary scale in which the problems are, of course, shared. So thank you very much, and I'm would be open and happy to questions or comments or developments of some parts. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you for that. I've got a bunch of thoughts and things to ask, so let me think of where to start. One thing I thought about from where you were starting at the beginning, where you reminded me a bit of the way that Franco Berardi Bifo talks about how, across many books he talks about this, about how almost like politics has been evacuated. You can't accomplish anything through politics anymore because what is governing us is sort of almost like economic, what would we say, automatisms. So it's almost like the structure of economic flows and logistics shape and constrain what is possible. I mean, maybe it's a kind of the same way that someone like, the Invisible Community will say that sort of logistics are sort of structuring and governing us rather than politics. And I think it's quite interesting the way you're talking about it in the city, because I mean, like, to give like, an example from not a comrade, the way that Margaret Thatcher talks about property owning democracy. So the way you're bought into a certain sense of self and to care, how to be responsible to the city, how to be civic minded, because as a property owner, you have interests. You have interests in sort of how finance works. You're interested in how the city works because of that. But when people become, precarious, both financially and more existentially, all of those interests that were structured through property fall away because you're no longer a property owning subject. Why would you care about maintaining the value of the property? And so that's interesting, sort of how that creates that sort of shift in the city, and it makes me wonder. I mean, not that we want to get into a New York conversation, but like, is something like Zoran Mamdani a kind of response to like trying to find a way to respond to that condition where you no longer have a connection in a long-term sense to the place you're in? You can't afford the city. You have to find some way of thinking about livability beyond just the sort of usual. That wasn't a question. That was like a bunch of things rolled together.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think it's totally binded and related. I mean, first, what you mentioned as what Thatcher like mentions to how to be responsible of the city or the state because you also own it in a way. It's actually very connected with the form in which in Spain property was built also as a kind of biopolitical form of governing, in the sense of, I remember that in the 50s, during the Franco dictatorship, there was the Ministry of Housing, Arrese, it was his name, that was also governing the city of Malaga at some point in the beginning of the dictatorship, actually. He, as a head of housing of the state, he put a sentence that then became very famous. That is, we want a state or a country of owners, not proletarians. I mean, in Spanish it's different because propietarios and proletarios is very close. So it's a bit poetic in a sense, like we want a country, a state or a country, yes, of proprietors, not proletarians in a way. And these were the basis of the whole system in which housing and then also the new role of Spain during the transition to democracy and also in the European Union as a kind of touristic place of services and so on, and also a lot of housing developments where this was the main aspects as the infrastructure. In the moment in which before in the moments of the crisis of 2008, there was more than 80% of people were owning their places or in debt in a way, but in the process of getting the property. Now this is descending more than 10%, and is going down and down, and the situation is changing. And this is, I think, one of the breaks in which is quite interesting, in which it's not only not owning, because there was always big proportions of the city that were always left behind, but it's something that is extending towards more and more people, even though not all of them are realizing the potentialities of kind of confronting this into a kind of a different forms of understanding the city and so on. But at least there is a kind of material grounding for a different forms of engaging and gathering in the city. And I think the reason why, or one of the reasons why, the new mayor of New York and the elections in New York, that has, of course, global consequences and so on, is that maybe for the first time, the kind of the social democrats and its equivalence in the US, that is very complex, but we can call it this branch of the Democrats, something like social democrats, even though some of their politics are even leftist than European social democrats. Now, not in the 80s, that would be even communist at some point. But the thing is, once you change the axis of the discourse and of the politics in a very simple thing aspect, that is, we are being kicked out of the city and we cannot pay rent, basically. Even the minimum effort on putting the whole political discourse into that is very effective. Also with new forms of communication and being successful in many ways at the same time. But this was clear that was also effective, because I think there is kind of a ground, at least, or a possibility for these things to change and to focus on other forms of living the city. Of course, I would say New York City would have a lot of difficulties to develop it, but at least it's something interesting to know that something like that could at least connect with some people, which is always interesting.
Well, continuing to think about financial brutalism and staying with New York for a second, one of the things I remember Christian Marazzi telling me is in the 70s, when there was the fiscal crisis of New York City. Basically, New York City was bankrupt, and the federal government doesn't want to bail it out. And they eventually agree to, basically by structurally adjusting the city. And one of the conditions of that structural adjustment is this is the point where people's pension funds start to become invested into stock markets.
Mhm.
So if a previous form of almost like governing through identification is a kind of property owning democracy, your desires and interests are structured by property. Now we have a very clear example of the new form of financial subjectification, where you literally are invested and care about the stock market, not because you care about itself, but because if things go badly, there goes your pension.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very clear also in the some Nordic countries in which the pension fund is huge and enormous, and people are very dependent on that also. Yeah, I think this is one try of kind of what some people call the democratization of finances, and try to make everyone involved in the stock market in a way that like if the stocks go well, it's good for all of you, all of us. Yeah, so I think this is operating many levels. I think in places, at least the one I know here in Spain, Malaga, the south, and so on, there is still a lot of obstacles for people to trust in these things. Of course, there is an indirect, as you mentioned, not only in the pension, but even just having the money in the bank. It's already a participation in the whole thing. But I think at the same time, there are certain excessivism still with being part of that. I think now there is a growing understanding that of course it has also its problems, because the new fascism and right wing, it's manipulating it. That is not believing in the way in which things works, not only finances, but political systems, and many more. And maybe the financial system is the thing that is more high, that is not very clearly opposed. That in Spain in 2011 with the 15M movement and so on was the main focus of the whole thing. This was the objective of all the revolts in the squares and so on. It was especially this form of financial capitalism is what is destroying our lives. And now this is a bit more indirect. But yeah, I think it's a very complex situation.
I seem to remember some comments telling me about the conditions under which mortgage debt was secured in Spain, it being particularly harsh if you defaulted, and there being
Yeah,
large movements. Was it the PA that was organizing
yeah,
against against that? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I think Spain was and is still a huge laboratory for governing rent and a specific the specific forms of interest in housing
Mm.
in the first era, in a way, through selling. So it was in mortgages. So the whole trick was that there were uh, hardcore forms of being tied to the mortgage. So you could even lost your house and still having to pay the interest of the mortgage and the whole sum of the mortgage. So that was one of the more brutal consequences of that thing that never changed. Is still the same, and not even with the big demonstrations and the big movement that was around was not changed. And the new form of that is that now property is so high that it's outside the possibility of people to buy, and now this governmentality or these forms of experimenting with this violence is in rent. In
Mm.
Spain now, the protection for renters, I mean for tenants, is almost nothing. I mean, now it's a bit better because it's 5 instead of 3, but before that it was you sign a contract in which you are only 3 years protected in this place, and then you can be kicked out. Now it's 5 years, so it means that after the 5 years, the contract like actualize every year. So just the owner can kick you out whenever he wants, and also the rents are going very high. There is almost no public housing, so the situation is almost impossible uh, for for the majority of the for the population that wants to live in a place covered, which is all the people, of course.
Mm. If, if we could shift gears a little bit, I quite like at the end the way you brought back in the notion of intercommunalism, which originally is developed by Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party, if I remember correctly, to the later part of the Black Panther Party's time. And I like it for two reasons. And how it nicely fits into your argument. And because in Newton's formulation, there's first what he calls reactionary intercommunalism, which is the sort of networks of controlling finance, logistics, and supplies. Basically, he argues becomes more important than the nation state for governing things. And so that seems to be clearly quite what sort of like, in a way, you're kind of describing here with financial brutalism as how things are operating. And the second is through what Newton's favor, which he calls revolutionary intercommunalism, which basically, I mean, it starts as their way of trying to sort of like almost like renegotiate their relationship to nationalism, and basically saying that maybe the important thing isn't necessarily the state, but finding connections and commonalities without focusing on the state form. But I think that also works particularly well once power operates through these sort of networks and logistics which aren't necessarily state-based. If when that becomes the case, trying to find recourse to address that situation by going to the state is going to be, let's say, limited or maybe just fail because it's not actually in charge anymore. And I think that's quite an interesting concept to bring back now. And I think there's about a number of people trying to have been bringing back the idea of intercommunalism and sort of developing it, which is quite cool.
Yeah, and I also think that there is a lot of things, not only the Black Panthers, but also some authors of the Black radical movements, which are since long time, I think, developed something that I find quite interesting. That are certain things of kind of, I would say, communism practices and also anarchism practices, and they are using it directly without any kind of ideology purism, but more okay, we use both depending on different aspects, and the duality of powers is like one thing that some also kind of black anarchists are even quoting and using Lenin's ideas in certain aspects, and others are also using many things of mutual aid and forms of social cooperation that are kind of present in anarchist practice since long time. So, but what you mentioned about intercommunalism as that I didn't really I haven't read it before when I wrote this, so I'm very happy when you told me by email that was already even developments on that, which I think it's quite great. And I want to dive even more on that. Of course, because the non-focus on nation is very important, but as you mentioned, I think the other aspect is even more important. Also because, and here I like in a way the way in which I think Antonio Negri has developed it in the way that I don't know if precisely, maybe I'm putting a bit more than what he said, like beyond these limits, but I don't know. Is that a state, the idea of a state or a nation, is always presented as an illusion of unique power in a way. So you feel that you are governed by a power that has like total control on the things that are happening. And I think this is always an illusion. And this is very powerful because of what you mentioned, that the real need for these powers is to inscribe themselves in the everyday forms of communitarian kind of obedience and forms of cooperation and so on. So when it gets into it, it's where it's really powerful. And this is not always happening, and not in every place is happening. Of course, in places in which the state has a long history of development and so on, is very clear. And I have a very clear example here in the city of Malaga, in which the same party and the same mayor is governing since the 95. It's very clear when you see how the networks of power works in the city, and it's quite powerful in the sense of you feel it as a unique power, and in a way it is definitely now orchestrated by many, I mean, only a few group of people, and at the end, one person that is kind of governing. But it's more complex because it's not always like that. I mean, and you have the example that now if there is a change in the city and there is a kind of a social democrat or a leftist mayor, they will have no power at all because you lose all these networks from one day to the other, unless you kind of align with the interest of many of these powers, and then you can kind of relate to that. But I think it's always a kind of a balance that of course is very related with this financial brutalism that is present in the city, and that many of the people in the representative power are just kind of reproducing the interest of this economic development. So I think intercommunalism is a very powerful concept to kind of put the focus on this aspect of the everyday life that in a way is the thing that sustain the possibility of also resistance in a bigger scale, because the other aspect of waiting for the big break or the big revolution, it's okay and could be complementary, but if you have this interdependency prepared is much better, I would say.
Hmm.
And just the last thing connected with the New York thing, maybe the most interesting thing it's having reached so many people in the campaign that you have a kind of precarious network of communities and people kind of activated to try to develop other things. I don't know how strong they are, but the scale sound like there are tens of thousands of people like mobilized, and that's interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, indeed. Um, Maybe one more thought, and maybe we can sort of nudge it towards the conclusion then, or pause for the day. One thing you might want to look at, I was in this spring, I was visiting my friend Jack in Philadelphia. We were walking around South Street, and all of a sudden I see this big mural of W.E. Du Bois. Now, it's always cool to see a mural of W.E. Du Bois because, and it turns out it wasn't just a mural of W.E. Du Bois, it was a mural of his role in developing methods for basically developing urban sociology. So it was a mural about sort of like the sort of methods and sort of visual his mapping of the city he developed in the early 1900s and how it changed people how people understood the city. And there was a nice publication almost like his like I guess you would call it infographics and to try to understand represent the city through infographics and represent Black experience through infographics. And it was super interesting. And I hadn't seen it before. And it's very rare to see a mural to a radical Black thinker and their contribution to urban sociology. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that sounds great, and I will. And you know if this is also published in some place or
I will have to
no?
find the reference for you.
Okay.
I saw a book about it. I think it was put up by MIT Press, so it should be fairly easy to get a
Ah,
copy
okay.
of.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that sounds great. And now Dubois has been recently translated into Spanish now more and more. So that's also a great like reception of the work. And if there is something in urban sociology, even more because that's quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, we had just 3 weeks ago Ruth Wilson Gilmore here in
she's great.
Malaga, and she was great in this. We had a great conversation with her. Yeah, also in this concretely in jail infrastructures, but beyond that, the ways in which these also border regimes work in places like not only in the US but also in places like Malaga with the migrant incarceration in detention centers and so on. And that is also the yeah one of the consequences of the more violent consequences of that brutalism that I think is quite yeah quite visible in this sense.
Cool, cool. Well, I'm going to take that as a moment to thank you for coming along and that was interesting discussion. And thank you very much. And
Thank you.
uh, hopefully we will continue to keep thinking together in the future.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Stefan.